dissertation, Narrating Insecurity, Women's Activism in Kashmir. So with that amazing panel, we leave the floor to them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm Anna, and I'm going to moderate here today. And we will also have Dr. Emma Brannlund online. So she will participate also. What comes to my mind, my immediate mind, when I think about or when I hear Kashmir, without thinking very much, what comes to my mind? Beautiful pictures, beautiful mountains, valleys, lakes, flowers, the nature, the rivers, the waterfalls, the peaceful and serene nature, almost pristine, I would say. That's how I see the image of Kashmir, probably from tourist brochures, I don't know, and media. The second image is, of course, that of the violence, the militarization, the brutality of this extremely long conflict in one of the world's most armed area. And this image includes mostly men, wounded men, dead men, and funerals. Although I know that there is also systematic violence against women, but we don't see that much of this, I think. Another thought for me personally, when that comes to my mind when I hear Kashmir, is that one should be careful to talk about Kashmir in public, at least if you want to have a visa to India. It depends, of course, what you say, but it may jeopardize the possibilities to obtain a visa for India. It hardly never happened that the Indian ambassador in Sweden phoned us at Sassnet when I was the director there some years ago. But if it happened, and it did a few times, it always had to do with Kashmir. Something after a seminar or something we had published. Today we will discuss the Kashmir conflict from a perhaps a little different approach than what we normally see in the media and how politicians talk about it from a feminist perspective. And we have 3 speakers here, and we will start with Emma, who will be online and talk for 20 minutes. And then Amrita will talk for 20 minutes, and then Nitasha for 20 minutes. And we please save the questions for afterwards, so that otherwise there will be too many interruptions, I think. So I will hand over the word now to Emma from London.
From Bristol.
Bristol. Oh, Bristol, I'm so sorry. Sorry.
Can you hear?
Yes. Hello, thank you. Good afternoon. Just give me 2 seconds. For a long time I couldn't get any sound at all from any of the recordings, neither on Facebook nor on YouTube, but now I can hear you. So I'm just going to get my slides up. 2 seconds. Just 2 seconds. Okay, can you see my slides? No?
Yes.
Yes, we can see that.
You can see them, yes, and you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, because the problem is that I kind of would like to see some of you while I also see my own slides. So I think I cannot, it doesn't seem like I can do them on kind of the whole, in the whole screen way, but hopefully this works for everyone. So, okay, hello and good afternoon again. So, in this paper, I'm going to present some tentative thoughts about what feminist and post-colonial analysis can contribute to our understanding of children's lives in Kashmir Valley. So this talk is going to be about a project that I've been part of, a research project, and it's currently work in progress, so it's just some tentative ideas and findings. And this project expression to improve in well-being and particularly in terms of mental health. So this is an interdisciplinary project that is led by a colleague of mine here at University of West of England in Bristol, and has brought together arts therapists, psychologists, public health and art researchers. So as a social scientist working in the intersection of gender studies and international relations, working on this project has made me curious about how children living in contexts that are immersed in long-term conflict and systemic state violence in the form of occupation and colonialism express themselves and what they want to say about themselves and their lives. So the children that we have worked with, they live in a town in southern Kashmir Valley in the Indian administrative part. Which has, like the rest of the valley, been highly impacted by the long-standing conflict between India and Pakistan, as well as militarization and securitisation by the Indian government to stifle the popular movement for self-determination and securitisation, leading to a brutal crackdown of people's freedoms and rights. So children's lives have been severely restricted due to the ongoing security lockdowns and communication blackouts, particularly the ones following the events in August 2019. Schools have remained closed for more than a year, and due to the communication blackout, neither mobile nor broadband internet were working, so children could not communicate using their phones or laptops. And in Kashmir, many children have experienced militarized violence firsthand, having lost family members or witnessed violence, shootouts, crackdowns in their nearby areas. So growing up in a place immersed by militarization had a huge impact, and studies report deep levels of post-traumatic stress and depression, self-harm, suicide, interpersonal violence, and disruptive behavior. Furthermore, some children, particularly teenage boys, also participate actively in the independence movement, joining militant groups or participating in street protests against the Indian army. And often in international and Indian media, Kashmiris are portrayed monolithically as militants, terrorists, violence, and extremists. So in this paper, I'm trying to deal with this binary understanding of children on the one hand as vulnerable victims, helpless, oppressed in this conflict zone, and on the other hand, this portrayal of violent militants, terrorists, extremists. And so in order to understand and kind of unpack this binary and get a much more nuanced and complex understanding of children's lives in terms of conflict, I'm going to look at theories of children and childhood from a post-colonial and feminist perspective. And in much mainstream thought and international policy making, children are seen as innocent beings and childhood as a time of play, learning, and development. And we can see how this idea has been articulated in the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child from 1999, which sets out the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights that all children everywhere are entitled to. For instance, the right to relax and play, safe from violence, right to education, etc. And it is very evident that mainstream idea of childhood, as articulated in the convention, is based on the Western liberal model in that it's both rights-based, legally oriented, and individualist. So furthermore, this model is based on the idea that children are vulnerable and need to be protected. So a protectionist liberal discourse. Liberal feminist work has built on this, advocating the idea of the special status Hello, I'm back. Okay. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes. Apologies. It just crashed. The joys of line, huh? I think there are two of me here now, so it's okay, so maybe it's better if I can hear me. I will not use my slides. Maybe that makes it's what makes it crash. So where were I? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Apologies, I don't know what's going on. So yes, so I talked about the idea of children as vulnerable and need to be protected. So a protectionist liberal framework. So liberal feminist work has built up this advocating the idea of the special status of the vulnerable girl child as something that is object to protect. And this is this kind of specific status of the vulnerable girl child is something that we have seen in development discourse, education policies, etc. And so you can see here how in this the operation of binaries such as good childhood, bad childhood, west, east, rich, and poor, operating in these discourses around childhood in this liberal framework. And so this is something that post-colonial scholars have noted. Katrina Lee Koo argues that the liberal notions of childhood create an idealized notion of childhood, which is based on an affluent Western perspective. It fails to directly theorize the lives of children who live different lives, those who work outside or inside the home, those who engage in political activities, and those who commit violence, whether it's organized and non-organized violence, and these lives then becomes kind of block the notion of victimhood. So children whose experiences do not fit the remnants are seen as deviant, and the childhood is marked as moral, immoral. So furthermore, according to Huyuin, children are constructed as apolitical, so they should not only be free from political obligations, such as voting, say, participating in political protests, but also are seen as incapable of political agency. So locating them in the private sphere, away from politics and the public. So critical feminists are building on this argument and argue that this idea of the vulnerable girl child idea fails to consider the socio-political context in which the vulnerable girl is situated. So for instance, Srinivas and Palagopalan in their respective work argues that access to schooling in some communities in India, their works focus, is deeply embedded in hierarchies of caste and class, and so hence intersection analysis is needed. And therefore these activities activities need to address educational gaps, can not only be individualist, but also need to be structural and target dominating hierarchical structures. That these are based on caste, class, race, gender, or an intersection of these. So furthermore, feminists have also, in other contexts, responded to this essentializing discourses that treats women and children as prolific victims in the area of conflict and conflict and humanitarian response. We often see this through the narrative of women and children, and in one word, and the ones who are vulnerable and need protection. And furthermore, post-colonial feminists have highlighted this dualistic process of on the one hand, infantilization women, and on the other, the feminization of childhood, which is also obviously part of the colonial project. So Anne McClintock writes about how the idea of the family and its hierarchy are protected to the colonial imperial projects, the paternal imperial ruler governing immature colonial subjects. So kind of setting up some of the literature and the problems with the literature, going back to children in Kashmir. In the Kashmiri context of militarization and securitisation, there are these strong narratives of children circulating, children as helpless victims and children as irrational violent actors. And ultimately, these two narratives only serve the military strategy of India and Pakistan and the settler colonial projects, in that they reiterate the idea that Kashmir is an area that needs to be securitized, controlled, and civilized. In order, on the one hand, to protect the children from militant violence, and on the other, and traditional norms and practices, and on the other hand, to bring peace and security for stopping protesters and stone pelters. So we need to bring in post-colonialism and critical feminism to help understand children's lives without upholding the idealized notion of childhood as something universal, unitary, or reinforcing these binaries of good and bad childhood. Now I would really like to show my slides. I don't know if I can make it try. I'll try again. But I'm going to be brave. Okay. So in this project then, our students followed an arts-based theory program that in short followed the lifespan of a butterfly. So from laying the egg, through the hatching of the egg, through the arrival caterpillar, to the metamorphosis into a butterfly. So many of the arts productions that the children produced were revolved around the butterfly life cycle. So they're very beautiful, very creative, full of imagination and play. And the arts activities gave the children an opportunity to express themselves with colors, shapes, and textures, but also words, song, and body movements. They got a chance to explore fantasies and dreams, their futures, but also to create stories about their lives and their communities. So even though many of them were quite fancy, quite fun, quite joyful, but there were also some interesting expressions in the arts productions that demonstrates agency and resistance to the political hegemony of the state and kind of political consciousness and movements of resistance. So as I said, this is still work in progress. We're still kind of working on categorizing, analyzing production. But I wanted to share some of the things that we have seen so far. So the first theme that I see, one theme that came out is around gender and gendered violence. And so we can see many, some productions are talking about gender violence and gender structures and hierarchies, either within the family or local community or in kind of far away fairy tale lands. And just as an example, this first one here is a painting by a participant that we have anonymized, we call her Ifra for the moment, and which is accompanying a story written by the student Ifra about a woman who has experienced discrimination and racism throughout her life. And the mistreatment of this woman is worsening as she gave birth to a girl child. And however, despite this hardship that she's enduring, she kept standing up for herself. And the situation is getting harder, the discrimination is getting worse, until she gets support from an army of women. And she writes that, and I quote, "All kinds of women got together and achieved this great success. And now they're preparing for another battle, and then they believe that they can overcome anything, anywhere at all costs. Women empowerment." So this is a a really interesting example of both articulations of different forms of gender violence and discrimination, but also a feminist conscience built on solidarity and kind of building being part of some kind of feminist movement and feminist engagement. And they were not the only example, and many others as well, talking about women or girls standing up to different forms of violences. And the second theme that came out work focused on the environment and the damage to the environment taking place in different forms. So the first one here is kind of a landscape produced by student people, mascot, produced by different types of materials. And in this video, in a video that accompanies this picture, she presents a narrative about a butterfly that is worried about the environment because of the humans and the destruction of humans. So she's pondered on this destruction by the humans and what would happen in the future. And ultimately, then, when she's feeling worried and upset, this butterfly flies to a park to drink from the nectar. And then on the other side, you can see a poem by a student called Nitasha, which we can interpret being about global warming and climate change, but also maybe referencing the big floods in Kashmir that took place in 2014, where many houses were destroyed and many people's lives were taken. So, but here in these and in these examples and in many others, so we can see expressions, articulations of environmental awareness, engagements concerned about deterioration to nature and violence, to nature and environment, and kind of and discussions about what to do about it. And then in this third example, we see the third theme that we had seen is stories about betrayal and violence. And here I've chosen an example of, and this is just a screenshot from a puppet theater, which was produced by a group of participants as their final performance that they performed in front of their parents. And then ultimately we filmed it and made English subtitles to it too. And in this story, it's called The Prince of Egypt, and it's about when the king of this magical kingdom dies, he gives the throne over to his son, but then the son is betrayed by an uncle, and then ultimately there's a series of betrayals and violent intent of conquering and ruling this land, and who has the ownership and the right to rule the land, and who will rule the land justly. So there's a lot of themes here around violence, around politics, around governance, and there are other interesting stories and pictures from other students talking about role of government, role of politics, and kind of politicians and how so coming out through these pictures where students were not asked they were not asked to produce political pictures or political statements. They were asked to draw pictures often about butterflies and landscapes, but stories around politics in different forms came out. So just to conclude, I hope I haven't gone too much over time with all the problems. these are only just some examples of the huge number of work that was produced by the children over the course of one academic year. So during last year, and there's a whole complete discussion around the methodologies and both the project and also the methodologies of writing up the academic work. But here, I think through these various forms of art productions, we can see how, students expressing agency, resistance to dominating discourses and hierarchies, through both in writing, in stories, in poetry, but also in the arts and different forms of theater, and it demonstrates and it helps us to understand or get an insight into the life worlds of children living and which is beyond this binary of victim, helpless children and deviant militarized children. And here we can see on the one hand, we see serious political engagements, feminist articulations and resistance dominating power, but also a lot of fun and humor. And I wanted to share this last story about the tomato on the right by Tafsir, which is a fancy story about how to cook this dish with tomatoes and putting in choil and onions and spices. So there's also a lot of humor and personality coming out from these different pieces of work. So yes, I think I'm going to end there. And so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emma. This was Dr. Emma Brannlund from Bristol and nothing else, University of the West of England. Thank you so much for this perspective of the not so helpless children, which I think gives us some hope. So I will now give the word to Dr. Amrita Ghosh, who also has some slides. Please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. And I first want to begin by thanking the Nordic Kashmir Association and Malmö Feminist Festival, and my panelists here today, Nitasha, Kaul, and Emma Brannlund and Anna Lindberg. I have not and had not spoken to Emma, but coincidentally, my talk is also about art and feminist perspectives through the art. And I want to focus on the feminist representation and kinds of agency and what kinds of depictions of women are happening through art. Art and creativity form invaluable modes of speaking out, protesting, and resisting dominant structures of oppression and silencing. In a conflict zone like Kashmir, representation is saturated from hegemonic static structures with images of Kashmiri men and women in a certain light. And I think Dr. Lindberg and Dr. Brannlund both spoke about these kinds of binaries that are happening, either the wounded men or fetishized women and children in certain kinds of victimizations or militarizations. So either Kashmir becomes an exotic landscape that Dr. Lindberg also mentioned, escape for Bollywoodian imaginations that the famous book Territorial Desire by Ananya Jahan Kabir talks about extensively, or in the more recent imaginations, it's a conflict. It's a conflict, violence, and certain dehumanization of people happens through that paradigm also. Recently in the last, and it always has been, but it has come out as an emergence and plethora, new mediums of protest, resistance against everyday brutalities through art. And there are rappers, musicians, women bands, group of women playing musical instruments, songs like Kashmiri Bella Ciao, and I highly encourage people who have not heard it to go online on YouTube and hear that version. It's absolutely haunting, and it has translation on that video. Graffiti, paintings, all kinds of forms, clamoring for justice and representation in defiance, in their varied ways. And I'm using a certain phrase by Jared Martineau called creative combat, how art is used as a certain kind of creative combat. In framing this kind of feminist art from and on Kashmir, Martineau states, and I'm quoting him here, movements in artistic and cultural production have always existed in parallel to and intimate interrelation with political action. Acts of creation are entwined with movements toward freedom. Indigenous creativity, therefore, cannot be neutral. It provides a dynamic reflection of our contentions with the structuring logistics of settler colonialism and the resilient survival of our peoples, end quote. And his work is talking about settler colonialisms and that kind of indigenous resistance. And I'm using that framework to talk about what is happening with certain kinds of artistic movements within Kashmir and on depiction and representation of women. So the selected art and photography by women artists create forms of resistance and a decolonizing language that I'm really interested in towards freedom from oppression. I turn to two genres of artistic interventions, both by Kashmiri women within Kashmir and widening the peripheries to include some women artists working on gender depictions of Kashmiri women and the conflict. And women artists, this is definitely not the long list. There are innumerable artists right now from Kashmir who are doing fascinating amount of work with their art as expressions. First is an award-winning Kashmiri photojournalist, Master Zahara, who you might have heard of already. Another Kashmiri visual artist from Kashmir, Kaitul Abyad. Indian artist Raleigh Mukherjee, and another British-born artist with roots in Nigeria and Spain, Sonia Amrit Patel. All of their works visualize and capture dissent and agency in very interesting ways. It is not my endeavor, however, to dilute the extremely significant work done by Kashmiri women from Kashmir within that conflict zone and the limitations that come with it, pervading their everyday lives. But what I'm trying to do is widening the sphere of artistic representation to show how art also starts manifesting a certain community, a dialogue, and radical possibilities that link women across boundaries to present a feminist global solidarity with Kashmiri women. First I present, so before I get into these four women artists, I want to situate a kind of a dominant representation that is out there to show how stark this is with media, with films, with status discourses, how women are generally portrayed. And I'm going to be very short with it. After 5th August 2019, when the revocation of Article 370 happened, and Kashmir is undergoing this blackout, complete severing off communication from the rest of the world, RåMango, and I think many of you know this incident, a very upscale clothing line, ethnic clothing line, they put out their campaign at this period, 2 months after, and they have a certain kind of representation of Kashmiri women. It's called Zuni, the campaign, and I'm going to show certain images here. It's emphasizes, I'm quoting their campaign, because Kashmir is about its people, which needs to be seen and heard. And this is during a time period when there is complete blackout of communication. So what kind of seeing and hearing is presented here? Many Kashmiris and some non-Kashmiris protested against this campaign by commenting directly on this particular Instagram campaign that ran. By the nighttime in India time zone, the campaign and its images had vanished. RåMango also came out and issued a public defense Not an apology, but a defense saying there is an assumption of intent and they were removing the campaign images due to public sentiment. And you can see the kinds of images here of the women. So there's this stunning traditional clothing. The campaign name is plastered across the face, a very metonymic suggestion of this kind of fetish produced about Kashmiri women. The face doesn't matter. Literally, if you see, it's on the woman's face. She's also surrounded by women, not exactly clear, sort of silent, empty of subjectivity. And I'm showing these images to show the kinds of fetishization and profit that is garnered from a silenced people during a time when they're undergoing the worst kind of blackout. And this has been the longest. There's been so many of them in years and years. To switch to a different kind of art and resistance in photography, photography in Kashmir has always played a role in representing the valley in the colonial past, also emerged as a critical tool of social witnessing in the past years or so through photojournalism. Deepti Misri's work on photography in Kashmir provides, she states that it provides a counter to the larger discourse of territorial desire in a particular article called "This is Not a Performance." And Emma and Anna, both of you talked about this kind of images that are saturated in the media within this militarized state. The dominance of such photography on women that I'm interested in, either as mourning or grieving, and there is a place of agency for that, definitely, but I'm interested in the kind of vulnerability and victimization it produces. And Deepti Misri studies photographs of eminent photojournalist Altaf Qadri and the role of photographs played in protests, documenting the conflict, and states that, and I'm quoting her, one of the central aspects of the APDP, Association of Disappearance, Parents of Disappearance People, protest relates to the use of photographs and the photography by the protesters. APDP members use photographs as a kind of proof in the face of state denial. So photography really creates a certain space to speak that. And photojournalism in Kashmir has thrived in a certain kind of early 2000s. It has been there, but it has come up with a really vital role in social witnessing. Alex Campbell and Charles Crichter discussed gender in photojournalism and explained that women are still underrepresented in photojournalism and do things differently because they gain access to the world of women, subjects who otherwise would remain underrepresented. So I begin with showing a couple of works by photojournalist Masud Zahra from Srinagar, and this is the first photo here. Zahra herself claims that one of her larger drives to become a photojournalist in Kashmir was because, and I'm quoting her, stories and perspectives of women have largely been ignored and buried in the Kashmiri and international media. I want to document the untold stories of women. This unraveling or having the camera's gaze on the women of Kashmir also carves out a certain emotionalization of the conflict zone, a term coined by Lady Cholyaraki. So in this first composition, I'm interested in the slice of this daily life that is upheld under surveillance. We literally see the form of military authority and an invisible violence that is visualized in the photo. The image perhaps is of a mother and the two kids accompanying the children on a day where it is curfew. The caption underneath had said, and Zahra herself explains it's a strike. That was the caption given. The streets are empty, signifying a curfew, and the frontal view of the photograph is blocked by a soldier with the back to the camera, the gun peeking out, if we can spot it on the left. The children are looking away, but the mother's face has this defined look directly towards the soldier. In the photo essay Strife, which comprises of this particular image and some others, Zahra explains the use of monochromatic black and white colors to capture the mood of sadness, suffering. Black and white create the kind of focus and distance. There's also a brooding element hanging in the photograph with the everyday violence palpable in the lives of women and children. The darkness of the image also creates a focus on the subject and yet removes us from it, that this is not our lives. The spectators are distanced from the scene. I'm going to move on to the second image here by Zara also. For the lack of time, I'm rushing a little bit. This is a second image titled "A Photograph of Kashmir," and Zara provides the caption, "As the whole world is under a lockdown and many come seeking tips from Kashmiris who have suffered the worst state-imposed lockdowns in the recent years. I want to use a picture of every day here to let the world know how the lockdowns are different here." This scene is also from the street, a mother and two children walking by, three of them holding hands, children looking at the camera, the mother's gaze downwards, away from the camera, and a slight frown is spotted on her face, if you can look intently. The image is especially striking to me in the way that the barbed wires are sprawled in front of them, the intertwined sharp edges visible to us, the spectators. Again, it creates a haunting reminder of the cage-like situation that this conflict has created. Stellan Windhagen and Anna Johansson's work on everyday resistance also highlights that agency is historically tangled with everyday power and contingent due to changing context. They call it resistance studies, and how agency can be located in the everyday lives, the practice of the everyday. James Scott also introduces the phrase everyday resistance, this every different kind of agency. One doesn't involve the visible rebellion or this kind of subversion and rise. And there's a lot of writing that has been done on this everyday sort of agency, also from Dr. Kaul's edited book, Can the Kashmiri Women Speak? I go on to the next couple of images. The next visual artist is Kaul Abiad, and she uses her art to document the truth, as she calls it. Quoting Abiad, "Living here comes with the responsibility of telling the truth," and talks of her art as visual documentation of her stories and truths. There's this macabre element. This particular image is called Children at War, and you can see that the skipping rope that they're playing with is actually a barbed wire, denoting that kind of brutal militarization of children. She began her art in 2016, surging conflict, and started doing graffiti first. She hauntingly states in an interview, quote, "We try, despite all the shutdowns, curfews, and surveilled life." The second image artwork by her is called "The Dance of the Dead," and this was extremely poignant. I remembered Rabindranath Tagore's 1936 use of waterproof ink series on women, and he's not really known about his art. Of course, it's a kind of an ignored subject, but there's this ghoulish, unsettling aspect to the women dancing amidst death, looming around, also a reminder of the half-wives, the mothers waiting for the missing sons, and kins in the family. Both of the images that I showed and the next one also called Women, and this is a kind of Tagore's artwork from 1936 that I wanted to compare with. This is the third image by Kaul and Abiad, and this is called Women from Kashmir. And this is also the same kind of black and white, but what is interesting in this image is women are all standing as if watching something in front, witnessing in this looming darkness around them. There's this comforting stasis, also questioning the in-betweenness of life and death in all these paintings. The next, I'm going to skip around to a new artist that I have come across due to the lack of time, that I know that I have very little time. This is Sonia Amrit Patel. This one is called Kashmiri Winter, and she is interested in portraying questions of agency on Kashmiri women. And the next one is called Red Blizzard. Her art, for me, it was very interesting because both are interested in the questions of speech, questions of how do Kashmiri women speak? There's this splattering of blood, hands crossed over the heads in the first image, resisting an everyday trauma. They're silenced, but they're speaking. Women in Patel's drawing are shadowy, fused with the shadowy landscape in the background. It's a classic reminder also of the famous Can the Subaltern Speak in post-colonial theory. These women are all speaking. They're resisting, defiant, but they're not being heard. Even though their mouths are visible, there's a suggestive horror and scream embedded in both of these artworks. The second painting also is playing on the speech versus listening, and the blood that they're speaking about, the violence that they speak, is splattered on many of the women. That is, I'm wrapping up, that is there. For the caption of this painting, she says, "This is the second artwork in a series on women in conflict zones. At first they whispered, the whisper grew to a scream. Now it is a clamor as they cry out against injustice." This artwork pays homage to the strong, defiant, and resisting women of Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir and their ongoing fights for rights, peace, and well-being. And all for women's art, and I'm quickly going to show two images by Rolly Mukherjee, which I wanted to get into some details. This is called Shadows Beyond the Ghost Town, where the trees that are growing out of the earth are actually guns, denoting the violence. And the other one is Drifting, where the woman is in a shikara across the lake, but she's carrying skulls of the dead people. All four women's art in the different mediums and genres of creativity construct networks of resistance and solidarity that produce generative sides of feminist protest and awareness for Kashmir on a global scale. And most importantly, they also claim back self-representation, countering the dominant gaze. These paintings and photography depicting Kashmiri women enact two forms of resistance for me. Firstly, they resist fetishizing Kashmiri women in the old status vulnerable passivity, or this kind of construct that the Bollywood has done, Kashmir Ki Kali, the beautiful maidens. Secondly, they present feminist visions that also challenge the militarized oppression and create global networks and community through their creativity. These artworks create realities in which Kashmiri women are the subjects, reclaiming their spaces, voices, speaking truth of the everyday cruelties and survival. Such art creates a counter-hegemonic force and spaces of emergent politics, shifting the narrative towards radical hope that we talked about in the earlier panel. And as noted, Kashmiri women artists enable a certain resistant imaginary trickling into feminist counterpublics. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Amrita Ghosh. It was also very wonderful to listen to some more agency and resistance through art and culture. Our last speaker, I'm grateful we have three such eminent speakers here today. Dr. Nitasha Kaul, you don't need the PowerPoint.
I don't need the PowerPoint, but actually, given that everybody's colored, is it possible to have the, does this have the internet?
Yes.
I think I will just, because I'm aware that we also need time for questions. So while he sets this up and the lights get turned on a little bit, I'll just continue speaking to save time. So I feel a special sense of, I don't know whether burden or responsibility is the right word, as a Kashmiri woman here on this panel who is also, who is also an artist of sorts. In the sense of writing, but also over time speaking about it. So instead of trying to maybe say everything that I would like to, what I'll do is I'll just take a shortcut, and for some things just direct you to things that are there. It's just maybe that'll be best. So right. So there isn't just the one Kashmir. There are many Kashmirs. There isn't just one kind of Kashmiri. There are many kinds of Kashmiris. And there is a systematic way in which oppression and parameters of who can say what is structured for different kinds of Kashmiris based on their location in terms of their identity and their geographical location. And it also, I mean, to audiences outside of India, it may seem strange, but the way that a very historically resilient structure like race works in the Indian context is caste. So to anyone from the region, every single person, all of us, literally our surnames, our second names will tell you a lot more. It's like they are codes. They will tell you something about which part of a country we are from, what our caste status may be. That would not necessarily tell you very much about class, about socioeconomic class and other vulnerabilities. It may not tell you whether one is, suffering from disability or something else, but it will tell you some very fundamental things, just the surname. So it's that structural, right? So that's the first thing to remember, that identity is encoded into the ways in which, so if I go somewhere, the length of my nose, people will say, oh, she must be from Kashmir, like look at the size of her nose. So it's literally like those kinds of, there's a whole kind of encoding around lines of identity get drawn at who we think we are and how other people see us. So at the I and as well as at the other person's I, as it were. So there's that. Then so there are many kinds of Kashmirs, but the territorial obsession, and this is something that I spoke about in the earlier session as well, the territorial obsession of the post-colonial, which is the decolonized, partition-created nation states of India and Pakistan, each of whom likes to imagine that they go back thousands of years. But actually, if you think about it, the specific identity India and the specific identity Pakistan only come into being in 1947, right? The other thing is that when they come in on the midnight of 14th and 15th of August 1947, the status of Kashmir is unresolved. It's actually, it's actually literally unresolved. There is this kind of prior erstwhile princely kingdom, that is that region, which has its own particular dynamics. And so these things are important to remember when we think about the status today. Now, what happens today is that there are, so from between then and now, we have two sets of competing nationalisms that are at work in the bigger countries and that are at work in Kashmir itself. So in the Indian case, you have a Hindutva idea, which is kind of more like a political use of Hinduism as a religion, which was the idea of India as a Hindu country, or as primarily a Hindu country where other people could exist, people of other religions, but their primary identity of everyone would be as Hindus, even if they belong to other religions. So Hindu, not so much only as a religious, but as a political identity. And but at the time, of course, India did not end up being a theocratic nation state. So therefore, there wasn't a state religion, and for all its problems, and there were hundreds, thousands, but for all its problems, that version of Indian nationalism did not function in quite the same way, in quite the kind of way that we see the version of Indian nationalism that is at work ever more now. So there is a contestation within the Indian nation state between a Hindutva and a kind of more developmental secular sorts of nationalism, or at least one that aspires to be developmental secular sorts of nationalism. Now, somebody could say that for the Kashmiris, both were the same. I would disagree. I would say if we say that everything is the same, then we're really not saying very much other than that everything is complex. I think there is a continuum, and what one kind of nationalism makes possible more overtly, the other kind has a different way of trying to do that discursively. So there are differences, and those differences matter. It matters that Gandhi may have had 1,000 problems, but Gandhi was not the same as the person who assassinated him, right? So there are differences, and those differences matter. So there's this kind of thing that's happening within India and within Pakistan as well, between secular and more kind of secular developmental sorts of nationalism versus the more religious sorts of nationalism. In the Indian case, of course, there's the complication that the region itself has also, there's Kashmir Valley, there's Jammu, there's Ladakh, there's all of the other bits that were part of the erstwhile princely kingdom, but now get bracketed or claimed here and there and have different, not necessarily all with the same interests. So if you want to think about something closer home, and if you're not familiar with this, and if you want to think about Europe, think of the Balkans. It's like that. In some senses, the kind of the patchwork nature of it all. However, now coming to the present, as I was saying earlier in my panel, and I will just, where we were discussing the book, that these kinds of nationalisms are all essentially territorial. No matter what, who's kind of holding up the flag. The idea is that we want the territory, we want to claim the people in its name. and that we want to be seen as being democratic, but we don't care for popular sovereignty. So this tension between democracy and popular sovereignty, of course, goes back a long time in history and is evident everywhere. But the idea that a democracy can be had simply by having elections is, of course, problematic, yet it's what we see everywhere. Democratic outcomes are basically held hostage by, everything from finance to algorithms. And that's what's happening in the region as well. Now, in Kashmir, of course, there's another kind of problematic divide, and here is where I want to go to some of the things that will hopefully, and I'm only going to go to some. How do I press enter? Okay, that I hope that I can just go to the English version of this and then click on a few things so that I don't have to repeat myself, because there are a few kind of images and articles there that will make this much more easier, make my job much easier here. Here, Kashmir. So. This is one I want to show you. Is this open, the link? Yes. Is it in a new window?
In a new window.
This one. Night first wants the. Okay. No. Oh. Sorry, I wanted it in the new window. How do I do that?
The first one.
First one was.
I see. So how do I go back?
Close it. You can just close it.
Close this window and it'll go back to the previous page. Oh, interesting. So now double click. Here, that's this one. Okay, excellent. Thank you. While that loads. So now where does feminist and post-colonial analysis come into all of this? It comes into this through, as feminists have told us, the personal is political, right? Structures of oppression are systematic, that it's not accidental, it's systematic. That rights matter, okay? That the nation state is a very problematic construct. So for people who are state parts of stateless nations, that even as people hold up a flag and say we want a state of our own, people get states of their own, and then the same sorts of things keep happening. So the struggles, in a sense, are unending, but nonetheless important. So the nation state as a system, the very idea of having these nation state systems that see power and rising power a certain way, which means that today for countries like India, China, Brazil, whatever, to be seen as rising powers, to be as powerful as the former powers, means to be able to do things with the same amount of impunity. So it's as if the underlying kind of metric for measuring what powerful states are is fundamentally flawed and does not really care for things like human rights. It's selectively used. It's a very hollow discourse, and the idea is not to give it up, but to keep pointing out the selectivity and the hollowness with which human rights discourse gets used. And why this? And post-colonial theory, because of course post-colonial. So many of us have been arguing post-colonial is not what post-colonial means. Post-colonial means that history is not over, coloniality is not over. That history happened both here and there. It's not, colonial history didn't just happen in the other parts of the world. Colonial history happened also in the places that were the colonizers. And that just by the fact of having been once colonized does not give immunity to a political entity from acting in ways that are also colonizing. So whether we see that with India in Kashmir, whether we see that with China may not be the good example because of the lack of formal colonization previously. But essentially what I'm saying is that colonization is something that can happen in the name of Western and non-Western entities. And equally importantly, human rights is not the preserve of any one part of the world. So it's not the one part of the world going to save everyone else, because we own human rights. Nobody owns human rights. And in fact, it's a travesty that the history of human rights is understood separately from the history of anti-colonial struggles, because, excuse me, how are rights West-based if the whole anti-colonial struggles needed to happen elsewhere? And equally then, for the rest, for places like, for leaders in India or Brazil or elsewhere today, to say that human rights is a Western concept is magnificently flawed. Like, how on earth could human rights be a Western concept? And you should be the last people to be saying that. But the reason you're saying that is because what unites these tyrants and oppressors and problematic people globally is selective readings of history. Is a very selective work of memory, how they choose to kind of tell the stories that they do. So in the case of Kashmir, these analysis are relevant in order to show some of the complexity of what is happening. So what is happening at the moment is that with every passing year, we see fewer rights for people who live there. There is a fundamental arbitrariness to how power is exercised. We also see a continuous weaponization of Kashmiri Pandit sufferings as a rationale for doing what is being done to Kashmiri Muslims. This is deeply problematic. And as you know, as someone, again, anyone from the region will tell when she has a Kashmiri Pandit surname, it is really important for us to tackle this head on. It doesn't do anyone great justice to say, Kashmiri Pandits, nothing ever happened to Kashmiri Pandits. Of course, Kashmiri Pandits as a Hindu minority, forget about the fact that what they were doing, etc., or the fact that some of them work for the state. Kashmiri Pandits were a minority and they were driven out. And the struggle in Kashmir also has competing versions of it. There is a radical Islamist version, which does not have the same level of tolerance for other faiths and minorities. And those would be the people who wouldn't have a problem with the Taliban. And that is real and it's true. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also people who want to think of freedom in ways that are actually liberating and much more tolerant and pluralistic for everyone. So I think it is important for us to tackle that head on so that it doesn't keep getting used by the right wing in India to say, oh, look, you're denying this. Nobody's denying anyone's pain. But the different communities' histories and memories get, to quote a very kind of Agha Shahid Ali, a Kashmiri American poet. And if you haven't read his poems, there's a book called A Country Without a Post Office. You should definitely try and get a copy. And in that, he talks about the way in which your history gets in the way of my memory. That these kinds of splits and differences between different communities are have just gotten so entrenched. And as with any conflict, the important thing is to ask who benefits. Keep on, who's benefiting from this, and who's benefiting from this today is surveillance, is weapons manufacturers, is people who benefit from corruption, is people who benefit from environmental degradation, is people who benefit from conflict economies. And that's a very powerful set of lobbies. So it's not easy to get people to understand, to quote Upton Sinclair, something when their salary depends on their not understanding. So it's not that people don't know or not enough people know. A lot of people know, but the problem is how do you create the material incentives for a different situation? And there's no easy way, but I think that critical consciousness is an important part of how we can do that. And no matter like which genre or intervention terms we make, the fundamental fact is that profit, conflict and entrenched conflict is very profitable, and it continues to be so. Do I have about 5 minutes?
A few more minutes.
Okay,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So at this point, I want to show you some of these things and close with that. So the first, maybe I should open them all so that then I don't get lost again. The first one you said, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if whether, has anyone here been to Kashmir who's not already from Kashmir? Can you raise your hand? I don't think you're visible on camera. One person. Okay. Yeah. So, other side of Kashmir. Yeah. So the strange thing is that when people from Kashmir who are divided by this line of control, and I've always said the wording is very, very precise. It's line of control. So you can't actually meet people who are, 50 kilometers away from you. But if you are on the other end of the world, somewhere in London or New York, you will meet people. and people will say, okay, you're from Kashmir. Which side? Like that's the first question. And then you get into, which side? Oh, and did you live there? And which region? It's your own identity almost always is this minefield. That's just no simple way of saying who you are, because there are also so many deductions that become possible. Because if you are revealed to be a Kashmiri Muslim, a Kashmiri Pandit, a Ladakhi, a Pakistani, a person from the Pakistani side of Kashmir, the assumptions of what your politics might be, are also. And if you don't happen to fit into that, then it's another problem. Then you have to say, oh, actually, I'm somehow a problematic, I'm not who you think I am, because I should read a person if you thought with my surname, but I'm not really. And I'm hoping that more people are going to be traitorous to those sorts of, kind of predefined identities, because we all need to do that. Otherwise, we're never going to move beyond this. And this is what, for me, decolonization means in our times. It's, because colonization in our times doesn't look like the old colonization, and therefore decolonization also means thinking things a bit differently. So I want to show you 4 or 5, this one. So this is one of the, it says 2013 here, but it was first written in the summer of 2010, when a lot of young people were killed and there was this big uprising, sparked by the death of a child first. And I was at the other end of the Himalayas then, and I wrote this long piece called Kashmir, a Place of Blood and Memory. And so it says 2013 here, but it was first written in 2010. And as you can see, it was also translated into Mariana here. And the other thing I want to show you, Kashmiri from funerals to communalization of a political dispute. So the thing with the merchants of conflict is that they want to turn political reasons into existential ones, and they want to say, well, it's not because there is this rights deprivation or people have this or that, kind of historical grievance or problem. It's because they are this. So it's very common to find the idea that, Kashmiri Muslims are latent terrorists, or Kashmiri Hindus are always somehow pro the Indian state, or Pakistanis are this. The idea that people just fundamentally, existentially, biologically are something is so common. I mean, you would think that it should be easy to contest, but it has such a strong hold on people's imagination. Literally like 2 minutes, I promise. As soon as I'm finished opening, I won't need time to show them the thing. I just need to open them. Because, yes, this one too. And there's one on the revocation. Yeah, this one. Okay, now I'm done. So now I just want to show you 7 or 8 tabs, and from each one I want to just pick out something and say, okay, this is right. I'm just going to agree here. So this is a photo essay that was published on August 15th. This is Indian independence, the day of Indian independence, historically in 2017. So this is so these are all pictures of Kashmir I've taken. This is one from the top of a hill outside the city of Srinagar. And you would see that the fundamental differences, this is, to Indians, Burhan Wani was a terrorist, to Kashmiris, he was a hero. You would, militarization of everyday life, graffiti, also around color. So, again, identity codings and historical racisms, Indians being darker than Kashmiris is also seen as a point of superiority because of course, historical colonization. So anyone who's fairer is better. There's also that. So this is kind of an area of downtown. This is what, the beauty, and then it coexists with this sort of kind of degradation and neglect, and that gets perpetuated because there's so little administrative responsibility and accountability. This is a graffiti that was 8 lakh Indian versus defenseless, uniformed, it should say, terrorists for military. And so there's this one. And then of course, the touristy version of it. Women, this is the APDP meeting. So I think the speakers previously have mentioned, sorry, I'm pointing there. The woman in the teal colored thing sitting like that, she's Parveena Ahangar, who's an association of parents of disappeared persons chairperson. And she's known globally for this. They would do this kind of memorialization of the disappeared, and now doing even all of that is just hard. This is from funerals to freedom. So here, I'm arguing that funerals and freedom, funerals and demonstrations in Kashmir become a seamless cycle. That a funeral results in being, protests, which results in people being fired at, which results in demonstrations, which results in funerals again. It's a cycle. And I draw upon Lauren Berland's theory of affect to say that, okay, thank you, honestly, just done. That, that there's, that in the case of Kashmir, what we see is a cruel optimism, that the desire is an obstacle to the flourishing of India as well, and possibly to Pakistan as well, to continue this dispute in this way, and yet it goes on. This is Kashmiri Pandits are a pawn in the games of Hindutva. As you can see, recognition of ground realities is really important. Kashmir Wala, oh, this is everything I cannot tell you about the women of Kashmir. Place of blood and memory. One of the earliest things I wrote on this, and the reason I wanted to specifically bring this particular article up is because I refer to, oh, that's very funny. Unless there's a reason why this website, okay, this is extenuating circumstances. A map of divided Kashmir has vanished from there. That's very, very funny because it shows India, Pakistan, China controlled bits of Kashmir, and that doesn't exist there anymore. I don't know if that's a computer thing or that has just vanished. I'll have to find out. But here I talk about how, Kashmir the exotic and Kashmir the cruel are the two ways in which Kashmir is perceived, literally, like Kashmir the exotic and Kashmir the cruel that we see. This one is, so what else do I think I want to tell you? That the dispute is political, but it has been communalized, very successfully communalized in a way that one fears that it just needs so much more effort to get people to see the political problem anymore. That now it's just all become visible only through the prism of religion, and you're with us or against us. Indian obsession with Kashmir by way of a gendered analysis, that that how the violence is through representation. Again, Amrita mentioned that previously, Emma as well. Cartography and possession, this desire to possess that, Kashmir gets feminized. Finding the ways forward. So I think the way we talk about it as scholars is also important. As scholars, as theorists, as people, because we should not keep repeating the entrenched paradigms. And that is so important. And let's keep talking about it when people aren't dying in that large a number. This is what I really, really kind of gets to me. Because when there is an attack and 50 people die, it's all over in global media, right? But when people aren't dying is when the media people need to be talking about it, when we all need to be talking about it. Because otherwise, what sort of an incentive does that give to the people there? That if you're not violent, nobody is going to listen to you. So for heaven's sakes, if you know media, please get people to talk about these things without there being spectacular instances of violence, because that's really important. A testimony. I'm not going to show you this, but I will urge you to please read the testimonies of all of the people that were presented. I won't go into the points either. I do want to say China is to Xinjiang as India is to Kashmir. Parallels with Xinjiang are often not seen, but if we think about the repressions, if we think about the ways in which surveillance is used, the way in which economies of repression are being created, that authoritarian thing, the idea that India is democratic, China is authoritarian, oh no, there's technologies of repression that transgress democratic versus communist authoritarian systems. So this is, there's much more detail there. And lastly, thank you so much for your indulgence, Anna. Coloniality as development. So I just want to leave you with this idea of what I call econo-nationalism. This is it was published this year, but it's post-2019. The idea that now, just like, so what is the parallel between Indian rule on Kashmir now after 2019? There's a feminist lens, there's features of Indian coloniality. Why feminist? Because denial of consent, paternalism, enforced silencing, lack of accountability, the same sorts of things that we see as relevant from a feminist perspective when looking at the oppression of women, that their view does not matter, their consent does not matter. It's the same ways, the arbitrary exercise of power, the paternalism, I know what's good for you, you may not. Arbitrariness, divide and rule, humiliation, and a problematic idea of development, that the liberation is being done in the name of development. So like femo-nationalism, like homo-nationalism, where liberatory ideologies like feminism or rights for all people are used to, what's the right word, to think wash or to kind of, claim people in the names of spurious nationals. In the same way, development is used as a way of practicing something that, development is used in the service of a nationalism that works in order to, enable a colonial exercise of power. That liberatory ideas are used in order to dehumanize people. And this is being done with development. Like the whole idea for kind of shutting everything down in 2019 was that, it's for their good. It's because we want to develop them. So it's like that, the argument that came up. It's like trying to save Kashmiri women, trying to save Kashmiri people, trying to save the region from what they might otherwise do to themselves, and to think that one should get a choice between political and economic rights is, who does that? If one isn't colonial, why would you say you can either have your political rights or you can have development? But you're too problematic to have both, or you're not gender aware enough to have both. So it's at the level of logic. If one really got to be able to talk to people who put forward these views, you would be able to refute them easily. But the point is, would you? They wouldn't speak to you, and they wouldn't put you on their channels, and they wouldn't engage with you. So it's the discourse is kept partitioned deliberately so that you have echo chambers in Kashmir, in India, in Pakistan, elsewhere, where people aren't kind of listening to what is useful to be countered, and that's part of the problem. And I think feminists are part of every struggle. So in one or another way. So we have to keep thinking of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Nitasha Kaul. We are running.
Just call me Nitasha.
Okay, yeah. We are running a little bit late. We had some technicals at the beginning, and each speaker's a little bit, a few minutes, but you were so interesting, all of you, so it was really hard to just cut off. But so instead of asking any questions now to you, I will leave the floor open to see if we have any questions or comments from you here. To any of the three amazing speakers we have had here?
So we
Please.
talked about art. How does it help Kashmir in the long run? I mean, I don't see it helping Kashmir cause at the moment, because you see the government, it doesn't listen to people, it doesn't listen to anyone, and it has been continuously the same way. How will it help? You said there are many, it's helpful to different people, like arms organizations or others. How will art help Kashmiris or the Kashmiri cause?
Who would like to answer?
Because I can go. Because they how will art help anything? I think it's possible to ask that of art helping anything at all. But one, it helps the people who are doing it. It helps them be able to get through their everyday life, because resistance isn't just about, doing spectacular things. It's also about being able to get through your day when you're just, madly surrounded by an endless, situation that has very little hope for you. So it helps them live. So even if that art isn't art in the sense that it's put up in galleries, if it's just people writing or painting or whatever, or taking pictures, it helps them. And that's important. Because it's a mode of their expression, and it's important. And histories are long. So what gets written and painted and photographed today, in 100 years, 50, 75 years time, that will be a testament, a kind of a testament of our times. That's part of the archive of the people. So it's helpful in that way. Now, if you want to say, how does it help the cause? I don't know, because I would ask you then, is there just the one cause? I think right now there is a lot of, it's a very kind of divided situation. We can say, well, yes, the cause is self-determination, the cause is freedom, but it isn't like a struggle in the usual sense, in that there is a leader that has a lot of support and that this is what the cause is. Right now, it's just totally fractured and splintered, and there are all sorts of nefarious collaborations also that are part of how the landscape is divided politically. So there isn't a straightforward way that art could be part of that cause. However, art is sought to be manipulated by different people. So so for a certain kind of Indian liberal or global Western liberal, from a certain kind of liberal perspective, it's possible just to be good to these suffering people, and therefore just to kind of just be good to them, just save them without trying to know too much about what they need to be saved from or what they want. So in that sense, there is an attempt to kind of, oh, look, we had, so the state might kind of do these dance theater things with and say, okay, we are empowering the women. But like with any struggle, women's empowerment and women's control, it's like the Americans want to liberate Afghan women and the Talibanis want to protect the Afghan women, and women become the battleground on which politics gets constructed. So it's in the same way. Everyone wants to empower the women. And, and from liberal sorts of perspectives, there are problematic ways of appropriating art, and that too happens. However, there are also ways in which art can say things that you can't in normal speech. So it's, in a story, you can say a lot more than you can in a newspaper article, because, it's fiction. So in a book, you can talk about things that you can't. I mean, the Human Shield incident, the way I describe it in this, I would never, there's no kind of other genre in which we would be able to speak about it in the same way. So art also allows you to say things in ways that may not be possible for people. And it makes people think. So yes, there are all of those interests, but thinking and liberation and emancipation is really is anywhere, I think, the work of a longer period of time. And it doesn't, I personally don't think that recourse to violent means helps, because it ends up claiming the lives of Kashmiri men. It's not, so people could say, oh, well, if people want to do that, yes, but if I think strategically, if I think the kind of India, US, Pakistan, whatever, if I think UK, if I think these states lack morality in how they exercise their, actions, I think there's also a lack of strategy on the part of liberation struggles in trying to think of, well, you have the might of these kind of, rising powers. I mean, realistically, it's just not possible militarily to achieve these objectives. So what one needs is for people to understand why something is wrong. And for that, you need people to talk. You need people to kind of, to understand. And that includes Indians. I keep saying this at the risk of sounding like a very problematic person, but no, people in India need to understand what's happening in Kashmir. Because one article that I didn't show you called Loving and Losing Kashmir, because as I said that a better future for Kashmir requires a moral renewal of India. That, people in India need to understand what's happening and why that's problematic. They need to know more about the histories than what is kind of easily available. So art helps there. It helps people, not in that kind of straightforward way, but one could just as well say, what's the point of picking up guns? I mean, what is it doing other than, kind of making people be more easily targeted as terrorists or killed or, leave behind a lot more suffering? So I feel like there isn't an answer, but there's a kind of multitude of things that need to happen, and art is a very important resource in all of that. Nonetheless, it is something that can be manipulated on any and every side too, because the more neat your story is, the more easier people will believe you. If you say, I'm good and you're bad, or this person's good, this person's bad, easily, then, in a kind of very straightforward black and white way, of course, it's easier. So there's also that thing that happens within art anywhere. It's not unique to Kashmir, anywhere. And so it's so I'd say I understand why you think that it's not straightforward, but I think that art has a reason and a purpose. Otherwise, it wouldn't be.
Can I
Yeah,
follow
please,
very quickly?
please,
I
please.
think that it's a really important question also, because we tend to think that things are in vacuum, but they're not. Everything constitutes with each other. Science, politics, art, everything has its space and intersects, no matter how we think that they're in separate boxes. But also, I was walking out in the corridors here, there's this big poster, Art is Human Right. And one of the things that struck me that, there are certain spaces that cannot practice art. There's a certain feminist artist from mainstream India. She's not mainstream at all, whose work I wanted to show, including with the other 4 artists. And she specifically told me that she fears for her life and not to show her art. Mm-hmm. And she has done some huge installations, one of the first kinds, in a certain kind of intermediality of different genres together. And then you probably know who I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. But she did not want me to talk about her art. Mm-hmm. So art is dangerous. It can be extremely subversive, and it can change minds, as you absolutely said, that trickling of ideas is important, and art gives us manifold expressions of that. Writing, novels, different kinds of genres and mediums. So that helps in a kind of a political life of itself. Decolonizing mechanisms are possible through art. So I want us to rethink what art can do. And I absolutely agree with you that, violence is only one tiny way and not the right way, where many other languages are possible to deal with something and create changes within, whether it's survival, whether it's pushing the boundaries and transgressing them.
And perhaps in a more long
And in the longer
in the
picture,
longer
absolutely.
picture. Yeah, thank you. We should not spend so much more time here. We are already late, but I would like to ask if there is.
Right online, so she can have.
Yes. Emma, would you like to answer the question about art?
Well, yes, and what I agree with it, Nitasha and Amrita have said already. Well, I guess what's another aspect of art that I would like to add is just its capacity to build solidarity. There's universality in art form, in colors and expressions that can resonate. Universality is maybe a strong word, but it's arts, colors and shapes and feelings can be expressed through arts, and they can travel much more freely and more openly than maybe words and slogans or academic text can. So we can see through the different expressions that Amrita was showing and Nitasha was showing in the presentations, how those conjure both feelings, experiences, conditions in these specific political contexts, and it gives us a chance to emphasize, to recognize, to live with what is happening somewhere else. I think it has a very important role in communicating experiences across contexts in order to build solidarity, which I think is a very important part of any type of any political movement.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I add just one comment over there regarding the art? Actually, the problem is, okay, you showed that image, or who showed that image with two women and an army personnel there, right? So there can be another image where an army personnel is carrying a Kashmiri woman, helping her. I mean, how will 10, 15, 50 or 100 years later person differentiate whether there was oppression or they were helping people?
So-
it becomes really hard then.
No, I think that's, sorry,
Go-
please
go
go ahead.
ahead.
No, I'll speak up.
Please.
Well, you can totally see art being, as you mentioned, co-opted in extremely problematic ways. And, you have to read it with the larger picture of what is going on. And anybody discerning would be able to look at a plethora of the history is important here. And what happens is that there's subversive art, but art can also be extremely mainstream and cause those kinds of damages. But here's the thing I always think about: ethical reading, ethical futures and responsibilities. And all of us are talking about those kinds of subjectivities where we are interested in creating change. And one creates change and the other keeps the status quo maintained in a certain way. And so those are the kinds of differences that, spectators, viewerships are important in order to have a look at what creates those futurities that are more equal and more non-threatening and oppressive. And it's a clear juncture between the two.
And just to kind of
Last word here for today.
yeah,
I think
just
we have to stop.
just as a last thing. So there's an ideal sense in which one thinks of art as it goes. Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Yeah, that art has a purpose. Not all art is that, and I completely appreciate your question. I think it's really important to ask, it's not, there isn't anything kind of per se wonderful about the fact that somebody is doing art. So if the question is, does art do anything? The answer is yes. If the question is, does art do anything good simply because it's there?
The answer is no, it doesn't. It needs to, and the reason one needs to have to tell all of these other stories, because if they don't get told, if they don't get seen, then 50 years later, then those other ones are the only ones there are. And actually, there's nothing to fear from those images too, because that too is a part of that story, right? So if there are like 50, 100, thousands of pictures, then there's kind of more, multiple perspectives on what's going on, and not just the one. So it isn't that artists are just somehow more ethical, more wonderful people. No, of course not. It's entirely possible for art to be co-opted. I mean, you should see the amount of exoticization that happens in the case of places like Kashmir or whatever, on book covers everywhere. There's just kind of like beautiful otherness kind of art, or which on every side, both sides, every side actually. So it's not just that that's a problem in India. It's also problem like with misogyny and other such things, which is shared in India and in Kashmir. Patriarchy is shared in India and in Kashmir. So art in a broader sense, not just kind of drawing, is about is related to critical thinking in how I'm responding to you. Like art is doing something more, kind of comforting the common sense somehow. Unsettling the common sense somehow. So in that sense, art is useful. Because if we don't keep trying to, so we may not. There was this wonderful woman. She passed away. She worked. She worked for social justice, and she hosted one of my talks 2 years ago in 2019. And she said this wonderful thing, that if we can try and we may fail, but if we don't try, we'll never succeed. The idea is that one could do nothing. One could also not tell the stories, but then we would just be doing nothing.
Yes.
So we have to keep trying to change the world, because if not, the world changes us. And it's really as difficult or as straightforward as that. That's what we do.
I think that was a very nice way of ending it. We do have to try to change the world. Thank you so much. Thank you.